Eleanor, you know the $28 million is already ours. Don't make a scene, Victoria said with a calm certainty that made the air in the room feel heavier, as if every word carried a weight meant to pin me in place. I didn't respond. I just stood by the window, my hands resting lightly on the windowsill as the morning sunlight streamed through the partially drawn curtains, falling across the polished oak floor and glinting off the silver frames of photographs that lined the mantel. Outside, the oak trees in the front yard swayed gently in the breeze, the sound of leaves rustling faint but steady, grounding me in the stillness of the moment. Daniel lingered near the doorway, shifting from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. The clock on the wall ticked in deliberate rhythm, each second a reminder that this was a moment suspended, a quiet before any outward movement. I remembered the mornings when my husband and I would sit at that very kitchen table, drinking coffee from our matching china, discussing plans for the week ahead, never imagining that one day it would feel like a stage set for manipulation and subtle intimidation. I took a slow breath, noticing the faint scent of citrus from the cleaning spray that still lingered from the night before, a mundane detail, yet one that tethered me to reality. Victoria continued speaking, her tone smooth, almost rehearsed. You need to sign the paperwork today so there's no confusion, everything in order before the bank opens. I nodded slightly, my expression neutral, betraying nothing of the storm that had begun to form quietly within me. Daniel cleared his throat, stepping closer, offering a weak, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mom, it's all handled, he said softly, as if trying to mediate between us, though the tension in his posture suggested otherwise. I didn't move, didn't say a word. Instead, I allowed myself a brief glance around the room, noting the small details I had come to cherish over the decades, the soft rug in front of the fireplace, the neatly stacked letters and bills on the desk, the way sunlight caught the crystal vase in the corner, making the water inside sparkle like tiny diamonds. The house was ours, had been ours for decades, yet now it felt like the backdrop for a play I hadn't agreed to be part of. I thought of my husband, gone only hours before, and the life we had built together, the careful planning, the shared laughter, the quiet evenings that had once seemed infinite. All that care now seemed like fragile glass in the hands of someone who didn't see its value. I straightened my posture, exhaling slowly, feeling a subtle warmth rise in my chest, a signal that though I would remain silent for now, I was not powerless. Each movement Victoria made, each measured word, was catalogued, stored, filed away in my mind. I was listening, observing, weighing, and the silence itself became my first statement of strength. I let the tension settle for a few more moments, allowing the normalcy of the room, the sunlight, the ticking clock, to cloak me in a calm that contrasted sharply with the sharp edges of what had just been spoken. Finally, I turned away from the window, my gaze landing briefly on the papers Victoria had placed on the desk, my fingers brushing the polished surface without touching them, acknowledging their presence but refusing to grant them any immediate power over me. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her, his unease palpable, and for a fraction of a second, the trio of us existed in that delicate, suspended balance, each of us aware of the other's intentions yet moving cautiously, quietly, like dancers navigating a stage with invisible markings. The day had begun with grief, the loss of a man I had loved for nearly half a century, yet within those first quiet hours, I recognized the subtle currents of ambition and entitlement swirling around me. And though I said nothing, my mind was already moving, already plotting, quietly and deliberately, in ways that would become clear in the hours to come. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains of the dining room, casting a gentle glow over the polished oak floor where the remnants of breakfast still lingered on the table. Eleanor moved quietly, setting the plates aside and carefully placing the silverware in their respective drawers, each action deliberate and calm. She noticed the unopened letters from the bank and the lawyer, stacked neatly but waiting for her attention, a small reminder that the world outside her grief had already begun moving without her permission. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds outside were the only sounds accompanying her measured steps. As she poured herself a cup of tea, the aroma of chamomile and lemon lifted slightly, providing a subtle comfort that she held on to tightly. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, feeling the weight of the day pressing gently but steadily upon her shoulders. She glanced at the photograph of her late husband, his familiar smile frozen in time, a stark contrast to the quiet tension filling the house now. The mail in her hand contained notices and documents that required careful consideration, and she reviewed each line with precision, making mental notes of what actions might be necessary, what questions should be asked, and what information needed to be confirmed. She could sense Victoria moving about in the background, the soft clatter of shoes on hardwood floors, the shuffle of papers, subtle but deliberate, like a carefully measured performance designed to communicate control and intent without words. Daniel remained nearby, his presence understated, eyes occasionally meeting hers with a faint flicker of concern or perhaps unease, though he said nothing. Eleanor sipped her tea slowly, appreciating the way the warmth spread through her chest, grounding her, anchoring her in the present even as her mind navigated the undercurrents of familial maneuvering and unspoken intentions. She thought back to the life she had built, the years spent nurturing, guiding, and supporting, and the realization settled quietly but firmly that she would need to navigate this new reality with equal measures of patience, observation, and resolve. Each subtle movement, each carefully placed object, each unspoken glance became part of a tapestry of understanding, giving Eleanor insight into patterns, preferences, and priorities that would otherwise remain invisible to an inattentive observer. She noted the sunlight shifting across the room, the way it illuminated dust motes drifting lazily in the air, and took a deep, steadying breath, allowing the rhythm of daily life to provide a counterpoint to the storm of thought gathering quietly beneath the surface. Eleanor reflected on her husband's final wishes, the discussions they had held in confidence, and the sense of duty and integrity he had instilled in her, reminding her that calm, deliberate action often carried more power than sudden or emotional responses. She placed her mug down gently and allowed her gaze to wander to the grand piano in the corner, untouched for weeks, the keys gleaming faintly under the soft light. Each element in the room was a touchstone, connecting her to memories, to responsibilities, and to the enduring sense of agency that she refused to relinquish. She made mental notes of what needed attention that day, the conversations that would have to be approached with care, and the observations that would inform her choices in the hours ahead. The quiet hum of the household continued, punctuated only by the occasional shifting of furniture or the distant sound of a passing car, and Eleanor allowed herself a brief smile, not of amusement but of quiet determination. She knew that patience and careful observation would provide insight that impulse could not, and that her ability to remain composed in the midst of subtle pressures and expectations would be the key to navigating the unfolding dynamics with clarity and strength. Each sip of tea reinforced a sense of calm, a deliberate counterbalance to the tension that might otherwise have overwhelmed her, and she allowed her thoughts to organize themselves, charting a course through the intricacies of family dynamics, legal obligations, and the preservation of personal dignity. In this way, the day began, quietly but purposefully, with Eleanor attuned to the nuances around her, prepared to act with measured intent when the right moment presented itself, and determined to maintain the balance between observation, understanding, and the steady assertion of her own agency. Victoria paused near the hallway, pretending to organize the stack of documents on the desk, but Eleanor could feel the calculated rhythm in her movements, the subtle cues of someone managing appearances while quietly observing reactions. Daniel hovered at the edge of the living room, his posture slightly rigid, his hands brushing over the leather-bound books without touching them, as if aware of Eleanor's presence but hesitant to engage directly. Eleanor remained seated at the kitchen table, her fingers lightly tapping the ceramic rim of her mug, each motion slow, deliberate, almost meditative. She took in the quiet details, noticing the sunlight sliding across the countertop, the slight reflection on the polished surface of the floor, the shadow of a potted plant shifting with the breeze through the open window. Her mind traced the path of the morning, remembering small incidents that seemed trivial in isolation but now revealed patterns of subtle tension and controlled gestures. Each glance from Victoria, each soft footstep of Daniel, was a data point in the observation she had been conducting since the moment she had entered the room. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the conversations she had overheard over the past weeks, the soft phrases, the seemingly casual remarks that hinted at intentions, and she allowed herself to catalogue them quietly, without the need for confrontation. The letters on the counter, the invoices and statements, each presented a record of actions taken and choices made, and Eleanor examined them with careful attention, understanding that knowledge was her most effective tool at this time. She poured a bit more tea into her mug, the warmth comforting, a tactile reminder of stability amid the undercurrents of familial maneuvering. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair, her eyes tracing the lines of the cabinetry, the careful arrangement of plates and glasses, the the symmetry of the room that she had cultivated over the years. It was in these details, the order, the consistency, that she found her center, a contrast to the subtle chaos of the interactions around her. Victoria glanced toward her, offering a polite nod, an acknowledgement of presence rather than an invitation for dialogue, and Eleanor returned it with measured calm, signaling awareness without disclosure. Daniel finally moved to the window, observing the view outside, the rolling lawn, the distant street, the movement of a neighbor walking a dog, providing a mundane backdrop against which the tensions inside the house were made more acute by contrast. Eleanor took another sip of tea, savoring the heat and the quiet flavor, grounding herself further in the present moment, allowing the mind to map out potential scenarios, anticipate reactions, and plan next steps with patience and precision. The room remained silent but for the subtle background noises, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the distant hum of traffic, and Eleanor welcomed this quiet as an opportunity to reflect, to plan, and to maintain clarity in thought. She considered the past, the promises, the care, and the years of effort that had shaped the family dynamic, recognizing both the value of patience and the necessity of strategic action. Each moment of stillness was a reinforcement of composure, a buffer against impulsive response, and a space in which Eleanor's understanding deepened, her insight sharpened, and her awareness of the undercurrents of family strategy became more acute. She noted the shifting light patterns across the room, the gentle breeze moving the curtain, the way shadows played across the floorboards, and she allowed these simple observations to stabilize her, providing a calm counterpoint to the subtle complexities unfolding around her. In this manner, Eleanor spent the late morning, moving with quiet deliberation, observing, noting, and maintaining a calm vigilance, her mind actively engaged in deciphering the intentions of those around her, while her outward demeanor remained serene, composed, and fully in control of the small yet telling cues that would guide her next steps. The afternoon sun began to shift across the living room, casting elongated shadows that stretched toward the far corners, and Eleanor remained at the kitchen table, her posture steady, her gaze calm but sharp. The stack of documents that Victoria had arranged earlier now appeared even more significant, each paper a potential window into intentions, plans, and choices made without consultation. Eleanor studied the fine print carefully, noting the dates, the amounts, the subtle language that hinted at timing and sequencing meant to direct her response or lack thereof. She observed the subtle shifts in behavior from both Daniel and Victoria, how each movement seemed premeditated, a silent communication of roles and expectations. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a comforting background to the mental mapping she was undertaking, and Eleanor allowed herself to appreciate this simple pleasure as she maintained vigilance. She recalled quiet afternoons spent with her late husband discussing finances, property, and family plans, each conversation a lesson in prudence and foresight, and she realized that those years of attentive observation and careful decision-making were now her greatest tools. Victoria moved to the sideboard, arranging a set of papers with precise alignment, her movements meticulous, yet Eleanor sensed the underlying intention in every subtle gesture. Daniel lingered by the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame, his attention divided between the unfolding scene and his own thoughts, but he offered no words, merely a cautious presence. Eleanor took a slow sip of coffee, allowing the warmth to steady her focus, and she noted the sunlight reflecting off the surface of the polished floor, creating shifting patterns that seemed almost to highlight the positions of those present, a visual map of dynamics within the room. Each object, each movement, each glance was catalogued, stored, and analyzed in her mind, providing context and insight into motives that were otherwise unspoken. She considered the interactions of past days, the comments that had seemed trivial at the time, and the quiet behaviors that now indicated strategy and expectation, and she recognized that knowledge, calm observation, and deliberate response were her strongest assets. Eleanor shifted slightly, resting her hands on the table, feeling the texture of the wood beneath her fingers, and she allowed the room itself, the familiar furniture, the framed photographs, and the subtle hum of the environment to provide continuity and stability as she prepared for the conversations that would inevitably follow. The afternoon passed with measured slowness, each tick of the clock reinforcing her awareness of the passage of time and the importance of deliberate timing in action. Eleanor reflected on the balance of power, the subtle cues of deference and expectation from those around her, and the ways in which she could assert her position without overt confrontation. She noted the small details of the room, the alignment of chairs, the placement of objects, the way light and shadow emphasized certain areas, and she allowed these observations to inform her understanding of spatial and emotional dynamics. As she continued her quiet study, the calm steadiness of her demeanor contrasted with the tension in the air, creating a buffer of control that gave her space to consider, to reflect, and to plan strategically. Eleanor understood that patience and observation were not passive, but active tools in navigating the nuanced complexities of family dynamics and inheritance, and she embraced the careful rhythm of this approach as the foundation for the decisions she would make. Each subtle movement by Victoria, each hesitant glance from Daniel, was noted, considered, and incorporated into her growing mental map of intentions, a framework that would guide her response and ensure that actions taken were deliberate, informed, and measured. In this quiet vigilance, Eleanor found a balance between attentiveness and composure, a readiness to act when necessary, and a deepening clarity about her own agency, reinforced by the ordinary comforts and familiar structures of the home that had been hers for decades, now serving as both setting and anchor for the unfolding day. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, illuminating the living room in soft golden hues, and Eleanor remained seated at the table, her eyes calmly scanning the documents before her. She carefully turned each page, noting the fine print, the dates, the arrangements, and the signatures, cataloging everything in her mind with precision. Each small detail told a story, a sequence of decisions made quietly, deliberately, without her input, and yet she observed everything with clarity. Victoria moved quietly around the room, arranging folders, straightening papers, aligning pens with meticulous care, and Eleanor took note of every movement, the subtle gestures, the timing, the manner in which she carried herself. Daniel lingered near the doorway, occasionally stepping closer to glance at the documents, yet keeping a careful distance, as if acknowledging the tension without creating it. Eleanor sipped her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest, steadying her thoughts and allowing her mind to remain sharp and attentive. She considered the flow of the day, the small sequences of action and reaction that had occurred since morning, and she recognized the patterns that had emerged, subtle indicators of priorities, intentions, and the careful orchestration of appearances. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, a constant reminder of the passage of time and the importance of measured responses, and Eleanor allowed the rhythm to inform her pace, moving through her observations with deliberation rather than haste. She glanced briefly at the framed photographs lining the mantelpiece, memories frozen in time, moments of joy and shared life, and allowed herself the faintest acknowledgement of the personal history that gave her insight and perspective in this situation. The sunlight shifted again, brushing across the polished wood floor and catching the edges of the silverware on the table, and she noted the way the reflections highlighted the precise arrangement of objects, a subtle visual reinforcement of order and control. Eleanor reflected on the conversations and interactions of the previous days, the carefully phrased comments, the seemingly minor gestures, all revealing a deeper layer of calculation and intention. She catalogued these mental notes silently, without a word, without overt acknowledgement, allowing her observations to form the foundation for informed, strategic responses in the hours ahead. Each sip of tea, each deliberate movement, each quiet glance around the room reinforced her awareness. Her patience, and her readiness to act when the appropriate moment presented itself. She observed Victoria's posture, the angle of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, and Daniel's hesitant motions, integrating these insights into a cohesive understanding of the dynamic in the room. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a passing car, the gentle rustling of leaves outside provided a calm auditory backdrop, framing her reflections and reinforcing a sense of control and clarity. Eleanor adjusted her position slightly, noting the way the afternoon light played across the furniture, creating subtle shadows that emphasized depth and space, and she allowed this visual context to enhance her perception of the interactions and intentions present. The careful consideration of every detail, the silent attention to patterns, and the measured pace of her actions created a sense of quiet authority, an underlying presence that spoke without words. She remained calm, attentive, and deliberate, understanding that this patience, this quiet observation, and the accumulation of insights would be the key to navigating the complex interpersonal dynamics and ensuring her position and influence remained firmly established. In the serenity of the late afternoon, Eleanor's mind worked steadily, compiling information, analyzing behaviors, and planning next steps, fully aware that in this environment, subtlety, awareness, and restraint were the most effective tools available to her, guiding every thought and action with precision and intent. The late afternoon sunlight continued to shift across the floor, casting long, soft patterns that Eleanor noted silently as she prepared to move through the next sequence of her observations. She adjusted the chair slightly, the sound of its legs on the hardwood floor faint but precise, and took a slow, measured sip of tea, feeling the warmth center her thoughts. Victoria was arranging the papers again, her movements precise, careful, almost rehearsed, and Eleanor catalogued every gesture, every adjustment, understanding that these small acts revealed the rhythm of her strategy and mindset. Daniel lingered at the edge of the kitchen. Hands clasped, eyes darting between the papers and Eleanor, the quiet tension between them underlined by unspoken questions and cautious attentiveness. Eleanor's mind wandered briefly to past family gatherings, quiet dinners, and subtle moments of guidance and advice she had offered over the years, recalling the way her late husband had once gently reminded her that patience and observation often achieved more than confrontation. She noted the angle of sunlight as it illuminated the edges of the documents, the way the shadows highlighted the careful alignment Victoria had established, and she let these visual cues reinforce her perception of control and positioning in the room. Each document, each movement, each glance was catalogued and filed in her mind, creating a mental map of intentions, patterns, and potential reactions that would inform her next steps. Eleanor's fingers lightly traced the rim of her mug, the tactile sensation a grounding element as her awareness expanded to include the subtleties of posture, expression, and timing. She recognized that every shift in weight, every hesitation, every micro-expression provided insight into underlying motives and plans, and she allowed herself to be fully present, fully aware, and quietly analytical. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the occasional distant sound of traffic, the subtle rustle of leaves outside the window provided a steady background to the mental framework she was constructing, reinforcing the rhythm and consistency she required to maintain calm authority. Eleanor recalled conversations with her husband about strategy, planning, and foresight, recognizing that those lessons were guiding her now, allowing her to approach the day with measured deliberation and quiet power. She observed the precise arrangement of objects in the room, the careful placement of pens, papers, and folders, noting the subtle indications of order, priority, and intention, and she incorporated these observations into a comprehensive understanding of the dynamics at play. Eleanor allowed her gaze to sweep across the room one more time, noting the angles, the lines of sight, the subtle tension between Victoria and Daniel, and she used this visual information to reinforce her mental framework, ensuring that her awareness remained complete, coherent, and accurate. Each sip of tea, each adjustment of posture, each observation strengthened her composure and her readiness, and Eleanor silently acknowledged the power of patient observation as the foundation for strategic, deliberate action. In this way, the late afternoon passed, Eleanor maintaining a state of quiet vigilance, cataloging, analyzing, and preparing, fully aware that her ability to navigate the complexities of the household and the intentions of her family depended on her patience, attentiveness, and measured response, each action and thought reinforcing the clarity and authority she carried within. As the sunlight gradually shifted toward the western windows, casting warmer tones across the living room, Eleanor continued her quiet observation, her senses attuned to the subtle rhythms of the household. She noticed Victoria pausing momentarily at the doorway, her eyes scanning the documents once more before straightening a stack with meticulous care, the movements precise, deliberate, and revealing more about her intentions than any words could. Daniel lingered near the sideboard, shifting slightly as if weighing whether to interject, his gaze flickering between Eleanor and the papers, a mix of caution and curiosity evident in his posture. Eleanor adjusted her position, placing her hands lightly on the surface of the kitchen table, the familiar texture grounding her, allowing a sense of calm and readiness to permeate her awareness. Each page she had examined earlier now seemed to convey more than just information. They held subtle cues of timing, preference, and the silent assumptions that had guided the actions of those around her. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a passing vehicle on the street, and the gentle swaying of the leaves outside created a tranquil backdrop that contrasted sharply with the intricate dynamics she was observing. Eleanor sipped her tea, letting the warmth provide focus and clarity, and she considered the implications of each document, each movement, and each glance, connecting the dots with patience and precision. She reflected on past moments, the quiet guidance she had offered, the shared experiences, and the lessons imparted in subtle ways, realizing that these memories provided insight into patterns that were now resurfacing in the behavior of Victoria and Daniel. Eleanor noticed the subtle tension in Victoria's shoulders, the careful placement of papers as a means to assert presence and control, and the measured hesitation in Daniel's steps, each gesture catalogued and interpreted without the need for confrontation. The afternoon light continued to emphasize the lines and angles of the room, illuminating the edges of the furniture, the gleam of polished surfaces, and providing Eleanor with visual cues that reinforced her understanding of spatial relationships and the flow of energy in the space. She allowed herself a moment to observe the way shadows lengthened and shifted across the floor, considering how the positioning of each person contributed to the dynamics of authority and influence. Eleanor's attention to detail extended to the smallest objects, a pen placed slightly askew, a folder aligned perfectly with the edge of the table, the tilt of a chair back, each element offering insight into priorities and intentions. She considered how these subtle indicators could inform her responses, how timing, presence, and patience could be leveraged to maintain composure and assert influence without overt challenge. Eleanor's mind moved fluidly between observation, analysis, and quiet planning, integrating the visual, auditory, and behavioral cues into a cohesive understanding of the household environment. Each sip of tea, each careful glance, each slight movement reinforced her readiness and reinforced her strategic perspective. She allowed herself to feel the steady rhythm of her own breathing, the grounding warmth in her chest, and the clarity of thought that emerged from deliberate observation and reflection. The sun continued its slow descent, and with it, Eleanor's awareness expanded, capturing nuances, patterns, and potential developments that would guide her actions with precision. She maintained a composed, serene demeanor. Observing the interplay between Victoria and Daniel, cataloging their decisions, and anticipating the unfolding sequence of events with careful attention. In this space of quiet vigilance, Eleanor found both insight and calm, a readiness to act decisively when the moment demanded, supported by the clarity and depth of understanding cultivated through hours of attentive observation and reflection, ensuring that every future step would be measured, deliberate, and aligned with her sense of agency and control. As the evening sun began to dip lower, casting a warm amber light across the room, Eleanor remained poised, her posture relaxed yet alert, her eyes tracking the subtle movements of Victoria and Daniel as they moved about the living room with quiet purpose. She noted the slight hesitation in Victoria's step as she reached for a folder, the careful way she adjusted her blouse, the almost imperceptible glance toward Daniel, who in turn shifted his weight slightly, eyes flickering between Eleanor and the papers before him. Eleanor allowed herself to breathe slowly, feeling the warmth of the late afternoon light on her skin, grounding herself while her mind continued to map the dynamics of the space with precision. She recalled the countless hours she had spent managing schedules, organizing events, and coordinating family gatherings, skills that now provided her with a keen awareness of rhythm, timing, and intention in human behavior. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second a metronome marking the cadence of observation and analysis, and Eleanor allowed the sound to anchor her focus as she considered the layers of strategy unfolding before her. The room itself, familiar and comforting in its arrangement, provided subtle cues, the alignment of the chairs, the slight tilt of a picture frame, the reflection of light on polished surfaces, all reinforcing the spatial and behavioral patterns she was interpreting. Eleanor took another measured sip of tea, the warmth steadying her resolve, while her mind catalogued the actions and reactions, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the rhythm of footsteps, the direction of gazes, and the interplay of silence and speech. She considered the implications of every movement, the possible intentions behind each gesture, and the way these actions might inform her own choices in the unfolding sequence of interactions. The sunlight continued to dance across the furniture, highlighting edges and surfaces, casting elongated shadows that Eleanor interpreted as markers of attention, presence, and focus, each one reinforcing her awareness and understanding of the subtle communication occurring within the room. She observed the patterns emerging between Victoria and Daniel, noting how small gestures, repeated actions, and micro-expressions conveyed information about priorities, concerns, and unspoken expectations, all while maintaining an outwardly calm and composed demeanor. Eleanor's gaze drifted momentarily to the mantel, to the framed photographs capturing decades of shared experiences, providing context, history, and a reminder of the long-term perspective that informed her current vigilance. She reflected on the lessons learned over years of attentive observation, patience, and strategic thinking, recognizing how these skills allowed her to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics with precision and discretion. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening, and the subtle shift of sunlight created a serene auditory and visual background that allowed Eleanor to maintain a high level of awareness without tension or fatigue. Each document, each movement, each glance, and each pause was integrated into a cohesive mental framework, enabling her to anticipate potential developments and prepare measured responses with calm authority. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair, adjusting the angle to better observe the room, feeling the stability and texture of the polished wood beneath her hands, and she allowed the rhythm of her observations to guide her understanding of timing, influence, and control. She considered the flow of the evening, the interplay of light and shadow, the positioning of each person, and the sequence of potential actions, allowing this comprehensive awareness to inform her next moves with clarity and purpose. In this state of quiet vigilance, Eleanor remained fully present, fully attuned, and fully composed, understanding that the power of observation, patience, and deliberate action would ultimately guide the outcome of the interactions in her home, reinforcing her authority, insight, and influence while maintaining a calm and controlled exterior that belied the careful analysis occurring within. The evening deepened into a calm, muted light that settled across the living room, and Eleanor remained poised at the kitchen table, observing, calculating, and absorbing every detail around her. The air carried a gentle warmth from the setting sun, illuminating the edges of the furniture, the framed photographs lining the mantelpiece, and the polished wood floor, each reflection providing subtle cues about the space and the flow of movement within it. Victoria moved deliberately, adjusting the placement of a stack of papers, her gestures precise, controlled, and revealing more about her intentions than she realized. Daniel lingered near the doorway, his posture slightly rigid, hands folded loosely in front of him, eyes flicking between Eleanor and the documents, as if measuring the balance of authority in the room without verbal acknowledgement. Eleanor sipped her tea, savoring the warmth that grounded her while her mind traced the sequence of actions, the subtle patterns, and the unspoken exchanges that characterized the household dynamic. She reflected on past conversations, the quiet guidance she had provided over the years, the careful observation of small gestures that had always offered insight into intentions and priorities, and she recognized that those lessons were now her greatest tools. The soft ticking of the wall clock punctuated the quiet, each sound reinforcing the cadence of thought and reflection, allowing Eleanor to synchronize her awareness with the natural rhythm of the space. She noticed the interplay of light and shadow, how sunlight highlighted Victoria's careful alignment of documents, and the slight hesitation in Daniel's movements, noting how each micro-action contributed to the unspoken narrative of strategy, anticipation, and subtle influence. Eleanor allowed herself to move her gaze slowly across the room, observing the precise angles of furniture, the placement of everyday objects, and the shifting reflections of light on surfaces, all of which reinforced her understanding of spatial dynamics and attention. She considered the potential scenarios, the sequence of decisions that could unfold, and how patience, observation, and measured responses would allow her to maintain composure and influence without confrontation. Each sip of tea, each subtle adjustment in posture, each observation of shifting shadows and movements reinforced her readiness, her insight, and her calm authority. Eleanor catalogued the actions and reactions, noting the rhythm of the household, the patterns of attention, and the subtle cues of control and submission, integrating these observations into a comprehensive mental framework. She reflected on the value of restraint, the quiet power of observation, and the strategic advantage that awareness and deliberate attention provided, understanding that in this context, calm vigilance was the most effective tool she could employ. The distant hum of the neighborhood settling into evening, the gentle rustle of leaves outside, and the fading warmth of sunlight created a serene backdrop that supported Eleanor's methodical approach, allowing her to maintain a steady, composed, and deliberate presence while mentally mapping potential outcomes and responses. She adjusted her position slightly, feeling the texture of the polished wood beneath her hands, grounding herself, and reinforcing the deliberate pacing of her attention and thought. Eleanor's mind wove together the information gathered throughout the day, noting the subtle interactions, gestures, and expressions, and she allowed this synthesis to guide her understanding of intention, influence, and the quiet assertion of authority. As the light shifted toward dusk, Eleanor felt a deepening clarity, a sense of control and preparedness, and a reinforced awareness that every movement, glance, and gesture she observed could inform her next steps, ensuring that her decisions would be deliberate, informed, and strategically aligned with her long-term perspective. In this quiet, steady, and intentional state, Eleanor remained fully present, fully aware, and fully composed, navigating the complexities of the evening with the calm assurance that patience, observation, and thoughtful action would guide the outcome and uphold her authority and insight within the household.